This is the Lenovo Legion 5i Pro. If you remember last year, I looked at the Legion 5 Pro featuring AMD's Ryzen 5008 series and RTX graphics, and it was one of my favorite gaming laptops for the year. It offered incredible price to performance ratio, the display was stunning, and the design was great, minus that massive Y logo at the front. Now, I have the updated version for 2022, but with an Intel CPU, hence the name 5i. They made a few subtle changes to the exterior design that I'll go over shortly, and of course, I will talk about performance. Spoiler alert, it's pretty fast, but that shouldn't be a surprise if you look at the specs that's packed underneath this thing. As always, I want to kick things off with the price. The model with the Core i7-12700H, 16GB of RAM and an RTX 3060 will retail for around $1,600 US. Our sample features two 1TB SSDs in braid that bumps up the cost by $300. We do have a bit of a bizarre configuration, so personally, I would pick up the base model that I mentioned earlier all day, any day. Now, there is something that I need to address that I've been seeing lately on Reddit, and that's regarding the pricing structure for these laptops. People assume that the Intel models somehow cost way more than the AMD ones. That's absolutely positively wrong, guys, because in general, Legion's actually hiked the price on both AMD and Intel models equally by up to $250 versus last generation from what I've seen. And if someone tries to convince you differently, they don't know what they're talking about, or they just haven't bothered to do their research. Now, what about availability? Well, I hate to bring this up, guys, but as it stands, this laptop is temporarily unavailable. Now, I just feel just as frustrated as you guys because some of the comments from our last videos or last few laptop videos was regarding availability and why we cover laptops that you just can't get your hands on. Now, when we received this thing in the studio, we checked and it was available for purchase. So we proceeded with the review, but you have to realize that we can't control the supply issues that laptop manufacturers are facing these days. I really hope the situation changes very soon. With that out of the way, let me walk you through some of the exterior design changes that Legion has done to the 5i Pro. So first things first, they have finally replaced that massive Y logo at the front with the Legion logo that looks more subtle. Unfortunately, it's not LED backlit like last year's model, so you're gonna have to live with that. But rest aside, everything else looked pretty much the same, including this storm gray finish and the aluminum top cover. The build quality is fantastic with minimal flex around the chassis, and the hinge is rigid and smooth to open, and there's less wobble, so that's great. Now, from a portability standpoint, this laptop won't really fit that bill since it weighs over 5 pounds and it's more than an inch thick. It's pretty much the same compared to the 5 Pro from last year. Not to mention, hold on, this included power brick is so massive. I mean, I actually had trouble lugging this thing around between my studio and home because it's a 300-watt power supply. So you need to make sure that you have enough room in your backpack to accommodate this giant setup. The interior space remains unchanged except for the color of the keycaps. So instead of getting black on gray set, you now get a uniformed gray color theme that brings in more consistency with the overall design of the 5i Pro. As for the keys, they are still one of the best switches that you can find on a gaming laptop. The True Strike system brings in a good amount of travel distance and feedback. There is less key wobble around the keys, so seriously, you can't go wrong with this setup. However, the RGB backlighting on this thing is not the greatest since Lenovo has capped a lot of customization. For instance, there are only 2-step brightness adjustments, even though this thing doesn't really get that bright compared to, stuff from Razer and even ASUS. And you only can adjust brightness through Lenovo's Vantage software, and there are also very limited lighting effects to play around with. So if I were to compare this to, once again, the Zephyrus lineup from ASUS and the Blade series from Razer, it kind of feels like a step back. Again, that is only if you really care about RGB.
So I'm supposed to just build this? The new K5. Customize your own with a ton of color options for the entire assembly, plus plenty of switch varieties with a hot swap body, or choose the retail black or transparent white models. The PCB mounted stabs are factory lubed, the RGB boost mode is freaking cool, and the Super Scan tech scans your keystrokes every half a millisecond for outstanding performance, all for a quality feel. The X-T5 K5 Compact. Explore your perfect 65% keyboard below.
Moving on to the trackpad, and it still uses the same modular surface as last year, which gets the job done with navigation, and the integrated left and right buttons are tactile, but I was actually hoping to see a glass surface this year, since we're seeing the competition including that at lower price points. I know that they reserve that stuff with Legion 7 series, but come on guys, I mean, just make it happen. The I/O setup is also very similar to last year. Most of them are located at the back for easier cable management, which I do like. So you get power in, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, HDMI 2.1, USB Type C 3.2 Gen 2 port with DisplayPort pass-through and power delivery of up to 135 watts, and an RJ45 jack. On the left-hand side, you get one Thunderbolt 4 port and another Type C 3.2 Gen 2 port. And towards the right-hand side, there is another Type A port and an audio jack, along with a webcam E-shutter switch that disables the webcam from a hardware standpoint. So I'm sure that'll come in clutch for those of you who value privacy. Speaking of the webcam, this is what the quality looks like. They are still using the same 720p sensor, so you're not going to notice a huge quality difference compared to last year's 5 Pro. I am a little bit surprised as to why they didn't upgrade to a slightly better 1080p sensor, because that's what we're starting to see with a lot of other laptops this year. The microphone sounds pretty good. It's actually one of the best that I've heard from a gaming laptop, because it does really well with background levels and all that stuff, so it doesn't sound too compressed. So kudos, Lenovo. The speakers are okay. They're still located at the bottom, and there is good clarity in the trebles, but there is no bass response whatsoever. Now, I did try to play around with the Nahimic software that comes pre-installed with this laptop, and honestly, I was only able to boost the bass levels by like 2%, which isn't all that much. You're actually much better off using an external pair of headphones or an external sound setup. The display on this laptop is fantastic. If you recall, last year's 5 Pro had a beautiful 16:10 Quad HD plus 165Hz IPS panel with G-Sync, and they brought that over to the 5i Pro. So the color gamut has remained unchanged, as it covers 100% sRGB, 76% Adobe RGB, and 77% P3. You can use this for content creation and even a little bit of photo editing. Plus, the brightness levels are one of the best that you can find for a gaming laptop, with our sample hashing out over 530 nits. You can't really go wrong with this screen, guys. It's just perfect. Upgradability is pretty straightforward on the 5i Pro. Once you get under the hood, you have instant access to 2 memory slots, which are already populated on my sample. Maximum supported memory is 32 gigabytes. The primary NVMe SSD is tucked underneath this cover, and there is another drive pre-installed on the other M.2 slot for storage expansion, since this spec comes with that RAID 0 configuration that I talked about earlier in the video. And let me tell you, the drive speeds are ludicrously fast. I'm dead serious, guys. Our sample was able to pump out over 12 gigabytes per second on read and over 10 gigabytes per second on write. Now, I would recommend backing up any sensitive data that you may have if you choose to go with this config, but yeah, these speeds are just wild. All right, so what about battery life? Well, the 82 watt-hour battery on the Legion 5i Pro isn't the biggest on the block, and the 12700H's efficiency can't be compared to the G14's 6900HS. But it still pulls decent numbers. But I'm sure you're wondering why there's a gap between the Legion 5i Pro and the Razer Blade. And it could be down to anything from different idle power states to background tasks. Heavy load suffers a bit too, because Legion runs their processor at one of the highest wattage levels even when it's running on battery. But look, if you're running a gaming laptop, there's no way you should expect to spend too much time away from a plug if you're running heavier workloads. Now, if there's one thing that Legion's known for, it's their cooling systems, because they're some of the best around, and they allow these laptops to be pushed quite a bit further than others without sacrificing height, weight, or even noise. And that's exactly what's happening with the 5i Pro again, with performance mode, which eventually settles the 12700H processor at a massive 105 watts, and even balanced gets in on the party by hitting a constant 60 watts. Remember, even the Razer Blade 15's boost mode only pushes the 12900H to about 60 watts. Considering both the 12900H and the 12700H have the exact same number of cores, this could be a really interesting comparison. Frequencies across every power level look very strong too, with performance and balance both sticking above 2.8 GHz, but check out what the extra 45 watt does. It pushes the 12700H to almost 900 MHz higher. That's some bleeding edge stuff, guys, but there's no such thing as a free lunch either. And that's where temperatures come in, because they do get sacrificed in a pretty big way in order to deliver that 105 watts of current to the 12700H. Honestly, this isn't the way I'd want my laptop running on a daily basis, so I'd recommend performance for people who tend to run short but intense workloads. But the temperatures in balance mode are another matter altogether. I think Legion's got a really good balance of heat management, speeds, and power going on here. Now, Legion does the same thing with the GPU as well. In performance mode, the RTX 3060 is pushed almost to the limit of what NVIDIA allows, so around 135 watts. And yeah, you heard that right, 135 watts on an RTX 3060. And even in balance mode, it tops out at around 95 watts. Now, remember that Blade 15? Well, it pushed the RTX 3080 Ti to just 80 watts. So it should be interesting to see where this thing lines up. Now, clock speeds are pretty crazy too, but this is another important thing to note, guys. While the processor benefited from the juice, the GPU only gets a frequency bump of just 300 MHz between performance and balance, even though it chucks down about 50% more power. There's a pretty big sacrifice in temperatures too, so I'd really recommend sticking to the balance mode even for gaming, because all of this leads to a bunch of things on the acoustic side as well. First of all, performance mode is really loud. I mean, it really sounds like a jet engine, guys. It looks like when you pump in one of these Alder Lake processors with this kind of power, it needs a ton of cooling to stay in check. Balance mode, on the other hand, it's that perfect balance of noise and performance. And the other interesting thing here is that quiet isn't really quiet. And that's probably because Legion's running this mode at a bit higher wattage than a lot of the competition. And with all of that off the table, let's quickly check the laptops I'll be comparing the 5i Pro to, and let me tell you, it is an interesting lineup. There's tons of variety here when it comes to wattages for GPU and CPUs, and remember, these days, power consumption matters even more than the name smacked onto the components. So I think when you compare the RTX 3060 running around 95 watts to other graphics card here, it actually might be pretty competitive, especially when you take into account the price of the 5i Pro compared to some of the others. It's not even close. Actually, this might be a bit of an unfair fight when you consider this is essentially a $1,600 laptop with a $300 SSD upgrade, battling against a lot of the other devices that cost $1,000 more. Let's start off with Cinebench, because it usually sets the tone for the rest of the benchmarks, and with multi-core, you can see the positive effect granted to the 12700H by the additional power. At 62 watts, it can beat the Blade 15's 12900H and even come close to the fastest laptops I've ever tested. In single core, the 12700H is still pretty good, but the ultra-high lightly threaded clock speeds of the 12900 series CPUs will win out all day, every day. That should also lead to an advantage for those higher-end gaming laptops if all things were equal. Based on those results, these next ones shouldn't come as a surprise. Basically, the Legion 5i Pro puts up an amazing fight against laptops that cost hundreds and in some cases thousands more. Like the Blade 15, which goes for over $4,000, and it actually gets its butt kicked because Razer capped its processor at such a low level. That just goes to show you, don't buy just based on specs, guys. The only other area where the 5i Pro falls a bit behind is in NLEs like Resolve and Premiere, where its RTX 3060 can't quite keep up with a lot more powerful GPUs, even if it's sucking back quite a bit more power. That isn't a big deal though, since considering its price, the amount of rendering performance it gives here is pretty darn impressive. And moving on to gaming, you probably already predicted this one too. And look, pushing a lower-end GPU to higher wattage is how you build some solid value like what Legion did here. These results might be at the bottom of the charts, especially in situations where the RTX 3060 runs out of VRAM in games like Doom, but they're still really good. Actually, I'd probably recommend this 5i configuration over pretty much everything else here, since it typically gets 75% of the frame rate of higher-end laptops at half the price. Now, those results actually tighten up a bit at high resolutions. Now, you might be thinking that is absolutely insane and wrong, but it isn't. What this shows is that at 1080p, the higher-end processors from other laptops sort of artificially inflate results, while high resolutions like these end up showing more true colors. And that means an RTX 3060 operating at higher wattage specs can give you performance that's almost equal to much higher end GPUs at a fraction of their overall price. So here's a deal with the Legion 5i Pro. Lenovo has taken pretty much everything that we loved about the 5 Pro from last year and changed a few design elements to make it look new for this year. The display is still gorgeous. The keyboard is one of the best you can find on a gaming laptop. You still get a ton of ports, although I am a bit disappointed by the fact that they've only included USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports instead of Gen 2. It's something that I did mention last year as well. I also think it's well priced, since the performance you get out of this RTX 3060 running at 95 watts, it can pretty much keep up with higher end GPUs that cost a ton more money. I'm hoping that we will see an AMD version of this laptop at some point this year, but yeah. That pretty much wraps up this review of the Legion 5i Pro. Let us know what you guys think about in the comments. I'm Ibra with Hardware Canucks. Thanks so much for watching, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Oh, and spend responsibly, my friends.